call black everything. Everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Sheena C. Howard, Assistant Professor of Communications at Rider University. She's the author of Black Queer Identity Matrix Towards an Integrated Queer of Color Framework. That's a 2014 publication by Peter Lang. And also the co-editor of Black Comics, Politics of Race and Representation, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2013 and which won the 2014 Will Eisner Comic Industry Award for Best Scholarly and Academic Book. How are you doing today, Professor Howard?
I'm good, thank you. Glad to be here.
I want to start off by, talking about this award-winning book of yours. When we think about comic strips, particularly historically, we don't think of it as a site of race. That all changed a few years ago when the Boondocks were initially published as a strip. And here you were able to collect this great collection of essays from all kinds of folks talking about the significance of race within the context of the comic book industry. Tell me how you got to the point of pulling this collection together.
Yeah, initially, I wanted to do a book on the ways in which comic strips spoke back to racism during the civil rights movement. That was my initial motivation for the book. But as I talked to people about the project, a lot of different people wanted to add into the book. So it ended up being the first chapter, a history of Black comic artists and their contributions and their trials and tribulations adding to this comic medium. And then we looked at representation of Black females, representation in manga, all from the perspective of Black artists. Because a lot of the things that I was seeing as a grad student studying comics was the history of comics that didn't mention people of color, and particularly what I wanted to study, Black artists.
One of the people that you mentioned in one of your chapters is Ollie Harrington, who did incredible work, again, in the 50s and the 60s as an expatriate, kind of writing and creating these images that spoke back to the United States and racism. Can you talk to our audience a little bit about the significance of a figure like Ollie Harrington?
Well, I think to just even for a person of color, whether you're writing in America or other countries about, the diaspora and the slave trade and things like that, I think the significance is just to have a voice, because comics, traditionally has been a very racist medium, particularly when we're talking about cultural gatekeeping, who's allowed to tell the stories. So just having a space and breaking into that medium is significant.
This seems like a renaissance moment for Black comics. When I think about, a figure like John Jennings, who I've been apt to describe as kind of the Aaron Douglas for this generation of Black intellectuals. The number of illustrations of his that show up on the cover of books. One of your books, for instance, I think about James Braxton Peterson's most recent book. What do you think the shift has been about? Has it been just simply access to the technology, access to different platforms, the fact that the kind of traditional comic strip industry around newspapers has largely been broken up and we have so many other ways to access these things?
I definitely think it comes down to social media economics, which is one of the things that I talk about in the book. All of these different communities having access to the internet, to creating web comics. So we can kind of cut out the middleman. We can cut out having to have certain connections in order to be published and publish our own work and grow our own fan base. And we've done it now to the point where, mainstream publishers are seeing, okay, there is actually a market for people of color in comics. There is actually a market for women. Even though that market has always been there, the myth that mainstream publishers have told us is that, only white males like comics. So we're just going to target to this demographic. And I definitely think it comes down to social media economics. And we've, especially African Americans in comics, have long struggled to create their own communities in social media. And now we're seeing that people are catching on that we can actually make money off of these minorities because they actually like comics too.
Were you surprised when Black comics won the Eisner Award last year?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, the book is based off of my dissertation at Howard University. And I was writing about comics. a lot of people, didn't really see the value in writing about comics, to be quite frank. And so for a scholarly book to be noticed by really, really pop culture in the comics industry was totally unexpected to me. And then because I was writing specifically about the African American experience, to win an Eisner, I totally didn't expect it. I was just happy to be there around all of these, great people in the comics industry. To be quite honest, especially as an academic, oftentimes I don't think comics is seen as, a significant piece of scholarship.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Sheena C. Howard, Assistant Professor of Communications at Rider University. She's a co-editor with Ronald L. Jackson II of Black Comics, Politics of Race and Representation. Comics, Politics of Race and Representation, Bloomsbury, 2013. She's also the author of Black Queer Identity Matrix, Towards an Integrated Queer of Color Framework, 2014, Peter Lang. Talk a little bit about this monograph of yours that you published last year.
A Black Queer Identity Matrix?
Yes, ma'am.
So Black Queer Identity Matrix is more of a kind of a personal book for me. As Black comics was more of an academic book. I was studying Black comics from an academic perspective. Black Queer Identity Matrix was more of a personal book, and if you read it, you can hear the personal tone in the book. But I also wanted to have that academic piece in the book because I do a lot of scholarship on the Black lesbian community, and in doing research, a lot of what I found was I'm having to use multiple theories in order to deal with race, gender, and sexual orientation. And I wanted to create a framework where someone could just use my framework to talk about race, gender, and sexual orientation, especially if you're studying Black lesbians.
A lot of this work that you've done, particularly around theorizing about Black queer identity, has been expressed more publicly in some of the pieces you've been doing recently for the HuffPost. One of which in particular was in response to one commentator's fear around the new television show Empire, that Lee Daniels and the producers of Empire had somehow had a gay agenda. And you speak back to that, for those who've watched the series. I mean, the series has been extraordinary on a couple of levels, but we have really the first accessible Black queer character within the context of Empire, really since Michael Boatman's character on Spin City, and to a lesser extent, at least in a different kind of platform, we can think about Omar in The Wire. Talk a little bit about the significance of the character, Jesse Smollett's character in Empire, particularly as we talk about trying to find a new framework to think about Black identity within the context of queer identity.
Yeah, well, first of all, a lot of my work has been about the Black experience. And like you mentioned, most recently, I've been writing Huffington Post articles about, Black queer identity. And a lot of that conversation has been brought up because of the show Empire, which is a very positive thing, especially on Empire, to see this Black gay male character who kind of bucks some of the stereotypes that people want to ascribe to gay males. He's not particularly effeminate, and I think that having a co-creator who is a Black male speaks to the importance of having different types of people tell different types of stories. And I did get a lot of pushback for that Huffington Post article. A lot of people, when they read things that have to do with Black queer identity, automatically for some reason they want to say, well, gay rights doesn't have anything to do with Black rights, even though the article wasn't about that. I think we really need to talk about that tension, which I do talk about in my book Black Queer Identity Matrix as well.
Have you enjoyed the show?
Yes, I've enjoyed the show, particularly because I think it speaks back to some of the traditional stereotypes that we've been seeing in media. I mean, you have a Black male who's graduated from an Ivy League, is dealing with mental illness. It has a gay Black character who's actually successful and actually speaking back to some of the homophobic tendencies that his father has. it's becoming, you know, a publicly traded company. So I think it speaks back to all of those traditional stereotypes that we've seen in the media. And of course, it's a drama. So yes, some of those stereotypes that we don't like to see are in there. But I think it's too simplistic of a criticism to say, you know, it's coonery. The coon archetype is a very specific archetype that started, you know, pre-Civil War. So I think in 2015, it's too simplistic just to say, oh, this is coonery. You know, I'm not watching this, or this is bad for Black people in some way, because those same criticisms were made about the Boondocks comic strip, and all of those weren't necessarily fair.
Are you troubled at all? Are you troubled at all by the fact that, particularly as so much of in terms of intellectual production now has been democratized, in the sense that everyone has an opinion. But not everyone is necessarily trained in media studies. Not necessarily everyone is trained to do some of the fine nuances around Black identity. I know I'm always troubled whenever folks, are described as cooning. As you mentioned, that's a very specific kind of practice from a specific historical moment. Just because you're uncomfortable with a particular presentation of Black identity, does that necessarily mean it's not a presentation of Black identity that deserves to be, within the mainstream, to share a space, if you will, with, as you mentioned in your piece, more dominant images of Black masculinity?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just said is getting to the heart of what that Huffington Post article talked about. I think that if you study media representation, you know that you can't come to these simplistic generalizations about shows such as Empire and across all forms of media, including hip hop music. A lot of the presentation of Black masculinity has been strong, heterosexual, sexual access to women on the backdrop of some representations being homophobic. You can't support gay rights or a gay male and be this strong Black male in the media. And so, yeah, I think that gets right to the heart of what the article was trying to say.
Right on the heels of all of this, of course, Kerry Washington receives an award from GLAAD and makes particularly stirring comments about, equity within the context of sexuality. Folks who are engaged, folks who embrace same gender loving relationships. And what was really interesting about that moment, Scandal itself has become kind of a site and a platform. When we think about Cyrus' relationship with his various lovers, including a husband, but of course the most recent storyline around Marla Gibbs and what was a decades-old relationship between two Black women. How important is it for a figure like Kerry Washington to be as public as she was in terms of supporting, choice in this regard?
I mean, I always think it's good when, somebody that has a platform, speaks out against, a group of people's humanity and their rights, and acknowledges that we have work to do, and acknowledges that, these people exist. And of course, when a celebrity does that, they're going to get pushback. I've even seen people say, oh, well, Kerry Washington addressed an all-white audience, all-white LGBT audience, and didn't address racism, which is a very valid criticism. But I always think that a celebrity speaking out on that platform for the humanity of people is a good thing.
You're watching Left of Black. We're joined today by Professor Sheena C. Howard, Assistant Professor of Communications at Rider University. She is the author of Black Queer Identity Matrix Towards an Integrated Queer of Color Framework, 2014, Peter Lang, and the co-editor with Ronald L. Jackson II of Black Comics, Politics of Race and Representation, Bloomsbury, 2013. It was the winner of the 2014 Will Eisner Comic Industry Award for Best Scholarly and Academic Book. You have a new project that you're about to engage in called Remixing Colorblind. Talk a little bit about that project.
Yes, actually, I'm very excited about this project. We just started shooting yesterday, actually, at a high school in Philadelphia. And what I've been seeing a lot, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, and especially some of the conversations that I've been having in my own community, is really intergenerational bias. People criticizing young people for mobilizing the way they have mobilized, using social media, using hashtags. And so this documentary is focusing on young people between the ages of 17 and 22 and their perspective of race, race relations and their attitudes towards race and race relations in America today. Because I don't think that we get to hear from young people a lot, especially when we look at the media. We're looking at, you know, baby boomers or people in that age bracket. And so it's the perspectives of young people today.
We've been joined today by Professor Sheena C. Howard. Thank you for joining us today, Sheena.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black